Hello, class. In this lesson, we'll be covering World War II, the war on the home front, and the Holocaust. This is lesson 11. Here we have a piece of World War II propaganda with Rosie the Riveter, the iconic poster "We Can Do It" that represented and recognized the service of women in the war industries during World War II. This one's near and dear to me. My grandmother worked in a munitions factory in Hampton Roads during World War II. World War II solidified the nation's role as a global power and ushered in social changes and established reform agendas that would preoccupy public discourse in the United States for the remainder of the 20th century. Notably, women entered into previously male job roles as African Americans, and others struggled to obtain desegregation of the armed forces and bring about an end to discriminatory hiring practices. Here we have a propaganda poster on the right, the women's ordnance workers, and it shows a woman. It says, "The girl he left behind is still behind him. She's a WOW," a woman's ordnance worker during World War II. Do keep in mind that as America is fighting to bring about an end to fascism and imperialism, Jim Crow still existed in the United States during World War II and in the post-war era. Here we have an African American regiment. African American regiments were still segregated during World War II. We're not going to see the desegregation of African American units until the Truman administration during the Korean War. The overwhelming majority of African American units are going to serve in the European theater in both infantry and artillery units. There will also be other service-based units that African Americans will serve in as well, like transport and other services like food services and the like. Minority contributions to Allied victory. Minority participation in World War II reflected social conditions in the United States because African Americans were continuing to serve in segregated military units from the Civil War all the way through World War II. African Americans served in segregated units. A lot of these African Americans were assigned to non-combat roles like transportation and food distribution, but as the war moved on, more African Americans are going to see combat in infantry and artillery. We'll also see African American aviation units like the Tuskegee Airmen. Nevertheless, non-combat or combat roles demanded the opportunity for African Americans to serve and to question the continuation of Jim Crow in the United States during the war years. One unit in particular that I just talked about were the Tuskegee Airmen, who served in Europe with distinction. They were a bombardier wing and a fighter wing. The bombardier wing won multiple unit citations for their service as a envoy in Italy, notably the Battle of Monte Cassino, which we talked about in lesson 10. And then the Nisei regiments, these are the Asian American regiments that served in Europe. They earned a high number of military decorations. This particular unit, the 442nd Infantry Regiment, was the most decorated military unit in American military history. Here we have a African American ordnance worker working in the shipyards. This is an image of the Tuskegee Airmen who trained in Alabama as a fighter in a bombardier wing. also known as the Red Tails. And this is the Nisei 442nd Infantry Regiment, the most decorated military regiment in American military history. Their motto was "Go for broke." They served in Europe. Contribution of minorities in the war effort continued. The communication codes of the Navajo were used. They were oral, not written language, and they were impossible for the Japanese to break. They served alongside the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific. Mexican Americans also fought in the Pacific and in Europe. Those units were not segregated. Mexican Americans and Latinos served in combat and non-combat roles. Minority units suffered high casualties and won numerous unit citations and individual medals for bravery in action. Here we have the Navajo Code Talkers, Mexican American soldiers, and this is Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter, who won the Medal of Honor posthumously after his death. He was one of 8 African Americans who received the Medal of Honor from World War II. He was in an artillery unit that served in Europe. He managed to capture 2 German prisoners of war and kill another 6 after being wounded 5 times. The Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention met from 1929 to 1930, and they attempted to ensure the humane treatment of prisoners of war by establishing rules to be followed by all nations. We've talked about the Geneva Convention all the way back to the first semester, History 121, where the first Geneva Convention met following the results of the American Civil War and the European Crimean War on the treatment of prisoners of war. The conduct of war often reflects social and moral codes of a nation. The treatment of prisoners of war often reflected the savage nature of conflict and the cultural norms of the nation. Notably, the Geneva Convention Accords were not closely followed in the Pacific at the hands of the Japanese. This is a very difficult photo here on the right, and that is an American serviceman that is about to be decapitated along the Bataan Death March. How the treatment of prisoners differed. In the Bataan Death March, American POWs as well as Philippine POWs suffered brutal treatment by the hands of the Japanese after the surrender of the Philippines in 1942. Japanese soldiers often committed suicide rather than surrender. We talked about that in the battles of Saipan and among others in Lesson 10. And the treatment of prisoners in the Pacific Theater often reflected the savagery of the fighting there. The treatment of prisoners in Europe was more closely followed through the Geneva Convention Accords for U.S. service members, but certainly not for Soviet service members and others at the hands of Nazi Germany. And here we have another image of the Bataan Death March. So, this is where we will stop for the first part of the lesson. In the next part of the lesson, we'll deal with life in America during and after World War II. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much.